بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله الذي لا معبود سواه ولا مخلوق إلا إياه، نحمده في جميع أموره ونستعينه على رعاية حقوقه، ثم الصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنام سيد الأنبياء والمرسلين حبيب إله العالمين أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطاهرين المعصومين وصحبه المنتجبين. Sisters and brothers, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Tonight I would like to start with a thank and a praise. First, I would like to thank the sisters in particular last night for giving me half an hour of relative peace and quiet. And also the brothers for cooperating. And since tonight we have the younger generation, the youth here, I would like to praise them. These are the faces and hopefully the power that would take the message forward, inshallah, to the next generation. Inshallah. So I'm grateful for the sisters and the brothers. A brief recap of what we talked about last night. I indicated that the consequence of Saqifa and the coming to power and the structure of the power that came to exist as a consequence of Saqifa, unfortunately, was a corrupt political system. That the first sacrifice was justice. Despite the fact that the Holy Quran repeatedly talks about justice as the cornerstone of the entire chain of revelation, we began to notice how the system, the political system, gradually but persistently deviated from the early path and led to a corrupt structure that not only practiced racism, dogmatism, favoritism, but the irony was that they used the same language that early on the Holy Prophet used to create what is called a reverse in consciousness. They used the same narrative to justify the corrupt system that came to exist and dominate the early Islamic era. We see particularly the third Khalif talking about the ownership of Baytul Mal, that the wealth of the Ummah should be within the disposal of the Khalif to do as he wished. And nobody had the right to challenge. And those who did paid the price. A society that during the life of the Holy Prophet predicated itself on the presence of individuals highly qualified within the early social and political structure, systematically they were marginalized. where Abu Dhar is exiled first to Medina, and then when Muawiyah feels or is threatened by his presence and the enlightening lectures that he gave and sermons and speeches, wrote a letter to the third Khalif that the presence of Abu Dhar in Sham is a threat and we have to send him back. So they send him back. What the third Khalif decides is to exile him literally to the desert, where he had to die by himself. The old classic structure that the Holy Prophet spent nearly 23 years of recreating from the Jahiliyyah turned, and this reverse consciousness, again, as I said, reached a point where now the same Sahabas that witnessed the Holy Prophet say, لا فرق بين عربي وعجمي إلا بالتقوى, not only accepted the supremacy of the Arabs, they justified these differences quite easily using the same language and narratives. When we look at the seerah, the life of the second Khalif, we see that first, by the way, this was done gradually. The process was not done overnight. It was a gradual process, in which first favors those Arabs over non-Arabs, between one group and the other, within the Arabs themselves, where Ka'b al-Ahbar, even if we accept that he was a Jewish convert, a rabbi that converted to Islam, becomes the religious advisor to the Khalif, to the third Khalif, at the expense of the entire knowledgeable individuals within the early history of Islam. It clearly indicates the direction that the social structure was moving and the political. This is exactly the reason when, after the killing of Uthman, Ali comes to power and people swear allegiance to him. The first lecture, the first sermon that he gives clearly outlines the predicament that the Muslim society at that time is facing. Ala wa inna baliyatakum qad aadat. The same calamity, the same crisis that the Holy Prophet and the early Muslims had to deal with and create the change in the consciousness, unfortunately, we ended up facing it all over again. But with a difference. That this time, it wasn't the old Jahiliyyah structure and the old Jahiliyyah custom and a way of life that we had to empty from the content and create new content in it. It was the Islamic culture that was made devoid of its spirit, and people were left with what we call shallow, superficial religion, that people adhere to prayers, fasting, Jum'ah, and so on, but the spirit of Islam, the justice and equity that was supposed to be the foundation of all faith, disappeared and vanished. Ala wa inna baliyatakum qad aadat. And if, he says it quite clear, if I am to be given that responsibility, I have no alternative but to shake the social structure and turn it upside down. The problem that we have with such a paradox, if one would call it, is the existence of two different form and shape of Islam side by side. You have the Bani Umayyah interpretation of Islam and it's their modality, and you have Ali and Abu Dhar and Salman's modality. very few followers, but the modality existed. 130 years later, when people began to think about documenting the early history of Islam, the majority went to accept the modality that existed, that had more prevalence than the minority. And ultimately, when it came to formalizing a language that culturally would define one group versus the other, one group called itself Shia, and the other group called Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. A few nights ago, I made it clear that the root of the conflict, those who look at history purely as a piece of a jigsaw puzzle, devoid of its root and linkage to the old history, they would think, well, the Shia and Sunni came to exist after Saqifa, after the death of Amir al-Mu'mineen, after Karbala, after something. The root of Shia and Sunni goes back to two definitions, two modalities in Islam. It has manifestation with the death of Ali. It has manifestation with the death of Hassan. It has manifestation with the uprising in Karbala, but the root has to go to different ontological worldview approach to what Islam is, and the role that Islam is supposed to play in the entire community. It has nothing to do with Ali by itself. It's much deeper than that. And the root of this goes back to the early history of Islam and the Holy Prophet. That's the time, and early on, what we call the Arab clan culture, etc., that we have to search to find out what happened. Within 25 years of the Prophet's demise, Bani Umayyah managed successfully to bring back the clan structure with its old custom, and no one said, hang on a minute, this is not acceptable. It's the depth of the crisis that we see Sahabas, that they saw the Holy Prophet talk about equality and universal justice. They used the same narrative of the Holy Prophet to justify inequality, the Arab superiority, etc., etc. We see this interpersonal interpretation, and now if you look at the language and the narrative, ijtihad. The second Khalif had every right to use his own intellectual analysis and reach a conclusion. Ijtihad. Even against the clear nas and statement of the Quran. It doesn't matter. Ijtihad. It was many years ago when I lived in England, a friend of mine came to write a paper and research about the root of the difference when we call gender inequality in language, academic language. The gender inequality in Islam, it goes back to the second Khalif. The Holy Prophet allows women to come to the mosque during the prayers, does bay'ah with them, where they swear allegiance to him as the leader of the community. The only difference is that physical touch is not possible. What he does, he brought a container of water, he puts his hand on one side of the container, and every woman within the community comes and puts her hand on the other, swears allegiance to the Holy Prophet. Those of you who have read the story of Ghadir, what did he do after raised Ali's hand? Put a tent. He has a very special turban, ammama, that he puts it on the head of Ali, a black turban, that always the Holy Prophet wore this turban to indicate absolute authority within the Muslim community. He puts it in his head, sits him in the tent, and instructs every Muslim that was present in that group. Some historians claim 120,000 of them, men and women, one by one, to go into the tent and swear allegiance to the new leader. What happened? By the time the second Caliph died, women were not allowed to come to the mosque even for Friday prayers. This was the Jahiliyyah mentality that came back. And then, 123 years later, people looked at the practice of the second Caliph as authority. You find it very difficult these days to go to another types of mosques. This kind of freedom where women and men are sitting side by side and trying to learn, interact, educate, learn and educate, give and take. In Colorado, we have a problem. Sunni sisters, they have to come to me as a Shia Imam to deal with their issues. Why? Because in the mosque, they are not allowed to participate in majority of issues. Jum'ah prayer takes place downstairs. There is somewhere else, high in heaven, organized in some obscure place in the mosque, where sisters are marginalized and isolated to go and sit over there. And we call it ijtihad of the second Caliph. Two different versions of Islam became active, side by side. Abu Dhar is active, Ali and they both are active as members or supporters of one interpretation of Islam, and Uthman and Bani Umayyah are active as supporters of another type of Islam. Where do we stand as far as these two versions and these two modalities? Only our trait and characters can tell us, can identify where we stand vis-a-vis these two interpretations. If we stand for justice, then it's one interpretation. If we stand for injustice, it's another. If we stand for equality, it's one in its totality, just not only gender equality, everything. We see it in another. And so on and so forth. It's our trait, our characteristics, our interpretation of the faith that clearly define us in this continuum of one side, the Amawi interpretation or the Ali interpretation. Well, to begin understanding these characteristics that we really need to have, we have to start with the Quran. What is it that we should have to clearly define us and locate us on a path that ultimately we can say we are the followers of Ahlul Bayt? Before I continue, I would like to again thank both brothers and sisters for heeding the message last night and turning their cell phones off. I'm grateful because it's really disconcerting in the middle of trying to present something and then you hear jingle bell, it doesn't work. So at least this is another reason why I really am grateful. It's hardly a community that I go to that I don't have to repeat myself every night, and then within a few minutes another sound comes on. So it is an honor to be in the presence of individuals that one warning is enough. Let's look at the Holy Quran and see how Quran defines the basic requirement of what we call humanity, that we must possess before we could develop ourselves further. First of all, Quran states that the true believer's life is a continuous process of learning and moving from one stage to another. The basic requirement we have been given by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when He created, or some people might, let me make this clear, in the academic circle, the use of the He language is not acceptable these days because of the gender inequality. I don't mean it in that text, in this context. I simply mean as a reference to the divine. People may believe God to be he, she, it, whatever. God created human. The basic requirement. We are given this physical reality. But we are told that this is the beginning of the process. There is a process of becoming for us to become Khalifatullah on earth. God's vicegerent on earth. It requires moving from one step into another. The story of Genesis, Surah Al-Baqarah, I think starts from ayah or verse number 30, 31 and then moves forward. At least there's a chunk of 4 or 5 or 6 ayahs over there that clearly defines the creation. The first thing that it does, it says that, by the way, if you look at the Christian and Jewish theological literature, to this degree we agree. Not the contemporary one, the classic one at least. That God created human being from nothing. They call it ex nihilo, which means the Latin word from nothing. It was a unique creation. From earthly material and combined with the divine spirit. This mix together naturally creates a complex reality and tendencies that human, and added to this human intellect, to be able to use that intellect to choose the path, wrong or right. Within our micro world, we have free choice, in which we decide. إِنَّا هَدَيْنَاهُ السَّبِيلَ, the verse in Surah Al-Insan, إِنَّا هَدَيْنَاهُ السَّبِيلَ إِمَّا شَاكِرًا وَإِمَّا كَفُورًا. Either accepts, we gave him 2 framework by which he or she would have to make a decision. Human intellect, as well as the external messengers. You decide what path you want to choose. Freedom to choose. So there is human intellect, guidance from outside, as well as addressing the complex nature that exists within human. One thing that we have to be aware of, inshallah, tomorrow night, the day after, and so on, there is, the first sermon of Nahj al-Balagha talks about this complex creation. ومن خطبة له عليه السلام يذكر فيها ابتداء خلق السماء والأرض وخلق آدم عليه السلام. After talking and discussing the creation of heaven and earth and the creation of the angels, moves to the creation of human beings. The Imam says that he took number of clays. Don't take it literally, you can take it literally or metaphorically. And mixed them together, then he blew into it out of his spirit, whereupon it took the pattern of human being. With mind that governs him, intelligence which he makes use of, limbs that serves him, organs that changes his position, sagacity that differentiates between truth and untruth, taste and smell, color and species, etc., etc. He is a mixture of clay of different colors, cohesive materials, divergence contradictories, and different properties like heat and cold. Then Allah asked the angel to prostrate in front of this, what has the potential to become the perfect creation. Technically, we have the potential to become the perfect creation, the image of the divine on earth, Khalifatullah. But let's be frank, none of us are close to that stage. How do we go from purely having a physical reality, which we call it human being, to where our spirit reflects that reality, is the jihad and the struggle that we have to go consistently through. We see in the Holy Quran, there are discussions, despite this complex creation, we see praises and criticism, praise and condemnation. Humans are condemned for certain characteristics, which are critical to avoid in our life, before we even think about becoming the agent of taking the message to somewhere else. Arrogance and ignorance, these are two negative traits. Ungrateful for God's blessing. Too rash in decision making. Become unruly and out of control when he is granted certain blessings, particularly wealth. إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ لَيَطْغَى أَنْ رَآهُ اسْتَغْنَى. When he or she sees himself or herself with no need, becomes unruly. Forgets that the blessing that he or she has is given to him or her by somebody else. Lacks hope. Easily controlled by ego. Despite, and this is the critical issue, despite having the faculty of intellect, permits the ego to dictate the intellect, not the other way around, in major decision making. We tend in our life and choosing of a faith, rather than use human intellect to choose a faith that convinces the inner being. What do we do normally? We choose a lifestyle first, and then search for a faith that condones and supports that lifestyle. Or even an interpretation of the faith that supports that lifestyle. The reverse process. Rather than structure our life to the faith, we structure the faith to our lives. And this is the verse in Surah Al-A'raf 179, وَلَقَدْ ذَرَأْنَا لِجَهَنَّمَ كَثِيرًا مِنَ الْجِنِّ وَالْإِنسِ لَهُمْ قُلُوبٌ لَا يَعْقِلُونَ بِهَا. In the day of judgment, the path to fire and damnation will be open for a huge number of people, either or creation from humans and jinn, simply because that power of intellect that was given to them was not used in selecting and choosing the right path. Human intellect plays a critical role in everything that we design and develop for ourselves and for our future. Inshallah, I've already gone beyond the time. Tomorrow night I will pick up on this, and inshallah we move forward. But before I leave, change the channel from English to Farsi, according to the program and agreement. Again, I need a couple of questions. I have about 10 minutes. So Could I ask brothers and sisters, for those who have papers, I can take it. We start with few of these questions. By the way, I have to repeat this, that on the day of Ashura, after the Dhuhr prayer, we have 2 or 3 hours of what I call open QAs. So those of you who have submitted questions and for time factor we were not able to deal with them, I have collected them. Inshallah, we try to answer them and address them on the day of after the Dhuhr prayer in moharram, but with a condition, with a proviso, that you have to be present. Those who simply submit a question which we have not addressed, and they are not present on Thursday afternoon, unfortunately, these questions have to be left until later. Could you please explain the concept of khums? When you may have your kids' college loan and other loans, etc., etc., how much do we have to pay for? Well, before we explain what is the concept of khums and zakat, let me explain one principle. According to Islamic worldview, every blessing that God gives us, there is a zakat and something that we have to contribute from it to the well-being of society. You have knowledge, there is a zakat on knowledge, share it. You have wealth, there is a zakat, and part of it has to be shared with the needy and the destitute within the community. You have health, you have to become active and use that health because it's a blessing, and again, pay its zakat, become active in social activism, etc., etc. Khums and zakat are part of using part of the wealth that God has given us, and most of you are fortunate enough to have, to be distributed to support the needy within the community. In Shia Islam, the Sunni jurisprudence only relies on zakat only, considers khums, which is literally 1/5 of the benefit or the interest that you make out of your work. The profit that is left over, 1/5 of it, they say this is only contingent upon certain conditions to be fulfilled, and it's during the time of war. Outside the time of war, it's zakat that has to be paid, not khums. Shia jurisprudence, however, says there is a distinction, or this differentiates between zakat and khums. Zakat is given to certain things, and khums is given to the general income. If you work and you have an income, at the end of the year, once you take out your expenses from it, whatever is left over, 1/5 of that net profit has to be given for the needy and the poor. The debate in jurisprudential circle is what is considered net profit within the Sharia perspective. Are we allowed to take the loans that we have from either for college or for children's education, etc., etc., out of it, and then whatever is left over? Or we have to make a contribution 1/5 before we take these expenses? The natural expenses are taken out, but the secondary expenses have to come after paying the needy and the poor. The best thing you can do here is to go to your own marja and the scholar and see what he says and explains regarding the issue of khums, and whether there are differences of opinion whether taxes that we pay here is considered to be part of it, before tax, after tax, etc., etc. There are similar kind of approach to the concept of khums as it exists when it comes to IRS and the tax that you pay. Certain expenses are allowed, Certain expenses are not allowed. In khums are similar. What is allowed, what is not allowed depends on the opinion of your own scholar. So it's better to communicate with them. Well, please explain briefly about who Abu Dhar was and his significance in Islam. I said I only have 10 minutes. And I've already spent nearly more than 5 minutes talking about the first question. Really talking about Abu Dhar's life is talking about what I call Islam of Ahlul Bayt. And I hope that during these nights up to now it has become clear what are we talking about. He was the manifestation of the true understanding, Ahlul Bayt understanding of Islam. Standing for justice, standing for equality, standing for balanced society, standing for equal distribution, etc., etc., etc. His life, there is a website that you can go to, it's called www.alislam.org. If you go online and then simply type in Abu Dhar and his life, it comes, and they have quite an extensive literature collected about the Sahaba. So I would refer the person who has asked the question to this site. It gives you much more detail than what I have time to explain. One more question, since I have a few more minutes. How much is that? You've been playing with that paper for some time. That's fine. But somebody, I want to keep.
Well, I want to know my question.
Doesn't matter. Within the Shia modality of existence, what do you perceive to be the major problems which inhabit our communities from success, or inhibit our communities from success on both worldly and spiritual levels? I think my main concern, sister, is not the worldly success, particularly in Western countries that I have traveled. We pay too much attention to the worldly success at the expense of what I call the hereafter. There is no balance approach that, going back to the issue of creation and Genesis, when Quran says that humans are a complex mix of the divine spirit and the worldly material, we can use this metaphorically to indicate that for a balanced approach to human life, we must pay attention to the worldly issues as much as we have to pay attention to the spiritual. We, unfortunately, when we look at the world, particularly in the Western circle, we seem to see more attention being paid to the material gain. How I can be more successful, better job, better housing, more money to pay my children, to put my children into higher schools, etc., etc. But we don't ask ourselves, what are the steps that we should take? Balanced society is made out of balanced individuals. What are the steps that we should take for our hereafter? If we believe that these are all blessings, what would be our role in the society, in making the society balanced and equitable? But not purely from the material perspective, but from the spiritual perspective. Even when we gain huge amount of money, the Qarun mentality takes over, that I have made it by myself. God has nothing to do, it's nowhere to be seen in the equation, and I don't need to spend it on somebody else. I have seen, within the Shia community, tell them we have a project that we need to organize the future of our children and you need to spend money. Suddenly everybody remembers that he or she has a loan or a bank problem or something else. But the same person that finds it difficult to pay a certain amount, I'm not saying everyone, but majority, pay a little bit for the future of our generations. Let them loose. They spend thousands of money for useless things to do with the material. I slightly may have different interpretation of that. I wouldn't say disagree. I may have different interpretation that it's not the worldly issues that is missing. Particularly in the West, we are paying too much attention to the worldly issue at the expense of other things. When was the last time that the community got together with, let's talk about individuals inside the house. We sit and we talk as a family structure. Look, Allah has blessed us by having a roof over our head, a food on the table, education and so on. And we inherently are obliged to think about those that they don't have it within the society and contribute for their well-being. Very difficult. Doesn't exist. We don't even discuss it. Let alone coming and sitting down and say, okay, what about the spirituality within the family? What about how we communicate with each other? What about respect and love within the family? What about respect and love within the community? Etc., etc., etc. Unfortunately, they don't exist. Hardly exist. Even when we have the opportunity during Muharram, Ramadan, or so on, we give priority to the time outside and only come to the mosque during where we can sleep tomorrow for a few hours more because it's Sunday or Saturday or a weekend or Monday and so on and so forth. The idea of sacrifice, this is what I said last night. The early generation of Islam knew right from the beginning that the path to Allah requires jihad and struggle. And they did struggle. They gave their lives, they gave their time, they gave their possession. The Holy Prophet moves from Mecca to Medina. After a few days, organizes a small entity called the mosque. And then goes late at night in the mosque to check. Within a few weeks of the Muhajirin coming to Medina from Mecca, he sees one of the most wealthy individuals in Medina living in the mosque. And he says, Ya Fulan, why you? You have a big house. Why are you living in Medina? You see the bondage? He said, Ya Rasulullah, I have a large house that has 5-10 rooms within it. The families that migrated from Mecca to Medina did not have a roof over their head. So I gave each room to a family. The room that I chose was the smallest. I cannot live in that room. So I left my wife and children to stay in that room, and I came to the mosque to stay there. Are you prepared to sacrifice that much? Are we prepared to sacrifice that much? This is why within 10 years or 15 years, a momentum was organized. The entire Arabian Peninsula converted to Islam. Because forget about the narrative, the language. These days talk about the polemical language, Islam spread by force. The entire people that were killed in different battles of 8 to 9 years, historians say 1,800. The civilians in Iraq that was killed out of American bombing exceeds 1 million. They really have, it's rich from them to teach us about human rights violation. But the reason why these people succeeded, because there was an absolute commitment to the faith. Full sacrifice. And this is why I said, Imam Zaman is waiting for us to intellectually reach to that level that we are prepared to submit to his command as the absolute leader and commit to Islam in the same manners that people committed in the early history of Islam. Then he will come back and lead the community. I don't see we have shortcomings as far as the physical reality It's the spiritual one that we need to focus on. Okay?
صلوات محمد
Now I have one more request from the sisters as well as the younger brothers here. Farsi is my second language. So those of you who have little bit of weakness as far as Farsi, and you withdrew literally as soon as the program starts to the back, could I plead with you, give me another half an hour and refrain from conversation until I finish. So if you are not that keen in listening to Farsi and you intend to go to the margin, to use what I call post-colonial language, to go to the margin, refrain from conversation until I finish this short lecture, that inshallah we will go and then you can have plenty of time to discuss things. So since Dr. Payman started with salawat, could I have the second salawat? And since we have already done two, let us do the third one, but the voice really loud.